Well, I'll start the recording, and we're really happy today to have Connor. Connor is one of the early people working on customer support and lead strategy, formerly at Airbnb, where I worked many years ago too as well. So I saw Connor's post on LinkedIn, and I think this was a few weeks ago, and I immediately resonated with it because there had been, I think, certain practices that we always think are they're sort of ingrained, but when you have like a more pure customer experience vision, you can actually start seeing these things as being more plastic and malleable. So I it was actually I believe Connor brought it up to Brian Chesky too as well. Maybe Connor, you can tell us a little bit more about that particular post that you wrote on LinkedIn.
Sure. Thanks a lot. So I left Airbnb earlier this year, and I sent a farewell email. And in the email, there's kind of a typical form for these emails, and people sort of recount their memories, and it's like high fives and thank yous to the many mentors and people who helped shape their experience. And I kind of wanted to buck that trend. It's cliche and it's wonderful, and it should be meaningful to you. But for me, I kind of wanted to share a story. I've been there for about 9 years, and I wanted to share a story and maybe inspire some of the people going forward. And I later realized that actually this email, might be actually interesting to people not at Airbnb, because it can apply to any professional context and even to personal context as well.
Mhm.
And essentially, the email was just about a meeting I had in 2013.
Mhm.
I joined in 2011. And so I was a couple of years into the job and spent about 9 years at Airbnb. And in 2013, there was an email, and we were getting a lot of tickets from hosts about payouts. And someone in the meeting, this guy named Daniel, had suggested, why don't we just pay out trusted hosts early before
Mhm.
the check-in? And everyone in the meeting sort of scoffed at this, including myself a little bit, like, what? That's not how Airbnb works.
Right.
We're almost like we're an intermediary, and it's like hosts are paid after check-in just to make sure there's no issues, right? And because that could be, we would withhold the payout if there was a check-in issue or cleanliness complaint or something like that.
Mhm.
And I later came to realize that actually Daniel, who was even more tenure than I was, he joined in 2010, understood that Airbnb is ever changing and alive.
Mm.
And so it was something that I came back to and revisited over my career at Airbnb. That it's important to recognize this, that we're here to help shape the business, and just it was a helpful reminder not to become complacent or inured to the way things are,
Mhm.
because it's my responsibility and that of everyone else at the organization to continue to carry it forward and to bring new ideas and hopefully see those come to light.
That's that's so true, and it reminds me of one of the core values that we often celebrated at Airbnb, which is to be the serial entrepreneur. And I remember that, like, this idea that the founders kept on, like cherish the core values, cherish the core values. Douglas Atkin, I remember from Community, was always saying this as well. And I think perhaps that's why we have core values, so that, like, even if we have traditions, or we have, like, let's say, standard operating procedures, or sort of, these legacies, we can always stand on more firm basis of, like, okay, we need to innovate, we need to think of a way to progress customer service. And I remember having a very similar talk with Brian once about this too, and he had been my guest in Bali, and we had talked exactly about the possibility of Airbnb entering, like, the luxury space, like things like these high end villas. And I remember speaking to Brian saying, "Hey, look, they all expect payment beforehand. They expect payment at the time of booking because they can't play around with their dates." And we had also talked about whether or not the 24-hour after check-in process should apply. And I was surprised because Brian said, like, the legacy of that came from the early days when it was an open platform. We didn't know who we were going to get, and so we needed to have that as safety. But if it's an established business, then it should be okay. And I think in that particular dimension, and this is what I think about when I think about strategical customer service. It's not about, like, necessarily following the rules so much, but it's more about thinking, like, what are the core principles. And I'd like to explore that idea with you a little bit more, which is, how do you approach strategy in customer service. There's so many different cases. There's so many ways to interpret cases. You train people to sort of deal with cases, but then things change, and then you need to kind of change the training. But then there's inertia already because they've already been trained a certain way. And I'm curious because it seems like it's one of the hardest things to keep agile. Like once you've developed these SOPs, okay, this is what we say to people in this case. This is what you say to people in this case. You generally kind of want to keep it there, but you can't because you always have to kind of think about, okay, does the process still actually serve the customer? Your interpretation of that, I'm very curious. Oh, Connor, you're muted.
Forgive me.
Yeah.
I've got a daughter downstairs, so she sometimes makes a noise. So I reflexively go on mute whenever I'm not speaking. Uh, in any case, oh, that's a great question. I think that it's really important that there's a focus on sort of the emotional component that endures despite the process. And I think the process today will look different than it does in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
The specifics, the details, the refund amount, whatever the details are, but the core component hopefully should endure, which is to support the people and not the process. I think travel is a luxury. It's important to remember that. For a certain set of people, it's just sort of like daily life, I guess, and everyone expects that they'll travel and sometimes abroad a couple times a year. That's not normal, and it is a really quite a big luxury. And so people save up and they get excited about a trip, and it's important to support them on that trip and to recognize that like tensions are a little high, or maybe their concerns are a little high because they've saved up money, they've invested this time,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that is a key element. It's important for the operating, procedures to adapt. One thing that, I don't know that we invested as much as we could have early on. And this is, hindsight. I'm not, I'm not criticizing the business in any way, but I think that supporting sort of like a consistent knowledge base, a source of truth.
Mm.
Because what you were speaking to earlier is that once people sort of have their SOP in their head a little bit, they sort of just carry forward with that.
Right.
And what you could see at Airbnb, and sometimes we did see a little bit, is a sense of tribal knowledge, they call it a little bit, where it's like this group of people were all trained in October 2015, and more or less these were the policies, and they sort of bled in. They're
Right.
not clicking into the refund question or to the lockout question
Right.
they're not looking even at it because it's so embedded in their sort of DNA, and thus they go astray a little bit.
Right.
As it relates to the specific policy or what have you. That can't happen, but I think that the more that you can, ensure that all members of the team on customer operations believe in and trust as a source of truth the knowledge base,
Mm-hmm.
the better that you'll be. That they'll reference it and they'll recognize that it actually can support them and that it is ever involving, ideally also based on their feedback.
Got it.
And so that's another thing that we tried to do, is to promote that Airbnb is alive and never changing. That the feedback is the taxonomy. Whenever every ticket is entered, we sort of tag it as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can tag things as feedback or whatnot. That we're continually evolving this. What you don't want to see is people saying, "Oh yeah, I look at the knowledge base and it's like from 6 years ago. It's collecting dust. It means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember, and here's what I'm going to do." And they sort of go rogue a little bit, and that's out of a sense of customer sort of belief, like, well,
Right.
I'm doing the best for the customer, and the knowledge base is way out of date. No one looks at it,
Right.
and I think we don't want that, of course.
Right. Right. Okay. This idea of knowledge base is very fascinating to me because essentially you're talking about things like you're writing down questions and answers specifically into a database, and then when somebody queries like, what do I do when a guest complains about like a hot water situation?
Yep.
What is the correct refund for that? There's already established cases of how we've solved this in the past, and a new customer service agent is able to then pull this information and read it and understand it. Is that what the
Yeah, I mean that's essentially how it works in a condensed way.
Okay.
Is that it's a repository of knowledge that that you can sort of guide yourself to the answer to the workflow that is applicable to that guest or host situation.
Interesting. So, okay, the approach then is to actually create a very powerful tool, almost like an internal Google, then like an internal database of, and then let people use their best judgment to.
Yeah, and allow some flexibility.
I see.
within those guardrails. And there's certain inputs too, like the value of the reservation, the host or guest profile in terms of like, well, they've been with us for years, and whether they have corroborating documentation, or they don't yet have it, or
Mhm.
they'll never have it. They've already checked out, so they don't have anything. And
Huh.
there are a number of different things there, but I think it is important that we don't whiteboard everything. And I think in the early days of Airbnb, it was a whiteboard. I
Right.
mean, essentially, I'm sure it was just Joe and Brian sort
Yeah.
of like, oh gosh, well, this seems like a crazy headache. What do we do? And they sort of whiteboard, well, what could we do, and that's just not scalable.
Yeah.
I think to do something like that. So it is important that as you encounter a type of case, and it's a lockout, like someone just they didn't leave instructions for how to get into the listing, or the code to get into the listing wasn't updated, or something like that.
Mhm.
It's like, we know this is going to happen, and
Mhm.
we know we have a kind of a playbook. It leads to just better customer experience. Like, no one wants to call support, and so
Right.
if we have a playbook and we can run through it and it works well, and then they can get service faster and hopefully just get on with their vacation.
Got it. Got it. Okay, that's a powerful technique. The question I was going to ask was one related to personal judgment, which is kind of like actually dependent on the context. So we're, our company is based in Bali, where it's kind of run by traditional hospitality minds that really believe in SOPs. So they believe that once a certain situation has been handled, everybody should just learn how to sort of fit any circumstance into those SOPs. But I thought that that's a little bit stale, because it's a little bit like if you're only given a hammer and a saw, then everything looks like wood and nails, right?
Yeah.
So it is necessary, I think, and I've seen the highest levels of hospitality that people will they will essentially direct more judgment to the person closest to the situation, closest to where the problem is. But then you kind of have a branding issue, right? Where like, all right, if everybody's going to just do what they think is right, then how do you have a consistent manner of service? But in the context of what you just said, and of having a knowledge base, being able to have that power of information at your hand, um, in that particular case, when you select people on your team, is it now more about the judgment of the person rather than, let's say, how trainable they are in following a procedure? Or like are you're deciding to bring people on your team with good judgment but not necessarily perfect execution, or good execution but not necessarily perfect judgment? Find
Hmm.
where do you find the ideal balance in that?
That's a good question. So in my years there, I worked with a couple of different teams. So one focused on sort of, multi-party, disputes or concerns from guests related to the host properties. Another one focused on sort of like occupancy taxes, legal issues, questions about like local laws. I think that, when hiring, the thing that mattered most to me was like the focus on the customer, and understanding sort of like the person of their interpersonal skills, essentially.
Got it.
I think that's really important, for any kind of customer service role, is to have that down and to understand, people as humans, to understand the emotional component there.
Mhm.
I think that the just follow a workflow element, works for Zappos. It works for some businesses. And let me be clear, I didn't run all of Airbnb customer service, or community support, as it's called. I ran a few specific teams,
Mhm.
and so it may be different to others. But for me, what was most valuable was finding people that were, of course, sharp, but also sort of had a keen sense of like how to relate. Sometimes difficult answers. I mean, sometimes we can't honor people's requests.
Of course.
And sometimes hosts want to take down a review, for instance, or guests want a greater refund
Right.
than is something that we're able to provide. And even when you can't help them, you can help them understand. And I think that was something I came back to like quite often with my team,
Right.
is that there are two ways, in my view, to help people. Is, on the one hand, you can help them with their direct problem. You can help them if they're locked out of a listing. You can help them reset their password, update their listing price in a very concrete way if there's a
Yep.
bug. But then you can also just help them understand. And that is a really difficult thing, because often you're helping them understand an option that's not what they wanted. But help them understand that maybe their time is better served moving forward, that this is kind of, we've reached the conclusion of this, and this is why it is the way it is. If they've got a product feedback issue, and they really want the bug fixed immediately, help them understand that we're kind of a large organization,
Mhm.
that we take it seriously.
course.
that you personally have taken steps to ensure that the right engineers are aware of this.
Hmm.
However, it's not in anyone's best interest for me to misstate the amount of time between when it'll be fixed.
Of
If
course.
I overpromise it'll be done this weekend, if the bug fix, no one's better for that. It might actually be a couple of weeks because that's just kind of the way it works.
Understood. That's actually what you just said. Sort of resonates a lot with me. I remember back. I think it was Chip Conley's time. Actually, he talked about the emotional equation. Disappointment is
Yep.
equal to expectations minus reality, and you can always work on either the reality side or the expectation side to to sort of get things better. Do you believe that that's the expectation side is the skill of customer service? In fact, it is kind of like a negotiation situation. I remember, I don't know if you ran into this guy before, but it was the Prez, Steve Wishnack.
Of
And
course.
yeah,
I helped train him. Yeah.
you trained Steve.
Yeah.
I heard
Yeah,
him.
I mean, he sat nearby in San Francisco, and so we worked together on some cases. And yeah, I helped mentor him.
Oh, wow.
He's a fantastic guy with his own skills and capabilities. So I take no credit for his success in the organization.
Wow,
But I will say that like we worked together when he was new on the team, and
wow,
I
wow.
was the lead at the time and helped on some of the more difficult cases.
Okay, that makes you a legend then, because Steve was very, very legendary.
I
Uh,
have a funny Steve Wozniak story, and forgive me, but
okay,
I want to mention this, uh, and hopefully it's okay to mention. But so I was one of the leaders of the team that sort of handled these kind of interpersonal sort of questions,
sure.
disputes, concerns that happened between hosts and guests. And Steve didn't report directly to me, but I handled some of the more difficult cases, and we worked together on a couple of things. We would sometimes send out sort of emails recapping sort of the week's metrics, some of the successes of the week. And there's, of course, a satisfaction survey that is sent to
Yep.
users or was sent to users at the time. I think now we use NPS,
Mhm.
but at the time it was a customer satisfaction thing.
Right.
And Steve got some good feedback.
That's what I heard.
And so we sent it out as props to the team, like, look, Steve got this great feedback. And what mattered most to me in that is these two words, and they were good counsel. And so this individual sort of wrote and said, I'm very satisfied. Steve was a great guy. And I appreciated the good counsel, something to that effect. But I do know the two words were good counsel. And I think that was really important because it's difficult. I mean, especially if you're a host, you're navigating a situation you don't have a playbook for it. We might, because we deal with millions of guests each year,
Right.
millions of hosts. But it's the first time you've dealt with maybe a kind of particularly needy guest or a
Mhm.
situation that's a little murky.
Right.
And having a sounding board and someone who is emotionally intelligent, who is sharp, who's not trying to rush you off the phone,
Right.
and to help guide you toward a place that makes sense was a really key component. And I think Steve was one of the best at
Yes.
Airbnb at being able to navigate those difficult situations, listen to people, and help
Mhm.
provide a good counsel when needed.
Okay. Oh,
Anyway, carry on with your question about Steve.
no,
Um,
that's
but I just can't help but remember that. That was
I
fantastic.
remember just all kinds of hearing stories about Steve. Like he came out to the Asian office quite often, and he was like, yeah, he was like a god. Everybody was like so in awe of his capabilities, and I kind of get that too, because I remember focusing on this particular. I remember one of Steve's particular skills was he would able he would be able to follow the user journey really well. Like I felt like he was almost always the guest, right? He would listen very carefully. He would reconstruct sort of the way that the counterparty was thinking. And he demonstrated this to me so many times. He talked about like, yeah, I have guests in this particular case. They love this. They're like this. So I think he essentially figured out a lot of different personas, and he
Yep.
figured out, okay, in this is a family traveler with 4 children. They have like, they have this type of job, and they are going for this type of reason, and they like this type of thing, and they watch this type of show on Netflix, right? And he was always able to collect enough clues where it would almost like he would be able to resonate. He would be like, okay, you probably like this too, right? And I think it was almost remarkable. It was almost like I would say that was even good marketing and good salesmanship, because he's listening so carefully. He actually can see the world the way that the guest sees it. That's a superpower, though. I don't know if that's necessarily a reliable or if that's even a scalable skill. Do you think it's a scalable skill, or is that like that's just some people will have that, and but we shouldn't expect to develop our customer support sort of service levels at that consistency across?
There's only one Wishnack.
Okay.
Go on record there. There's only one Wishnack. I think it's something too. It's a North Star, and I think that it can be trained.
Okay.
And I say trained in that there's like a permissiveness, and it's sort of unorthodox, a sense that people who come into this business and community support, customer service, are thinking that there's just the rigidity. You reset the iPhone, you go to the diagnostic tool, you go very specific, rigid steps,
Hmm.
and I think that Airbnb tried to allow a little more autonomy as needed, and I think Wishnack had an amazing ability to sort of dial into the emotions of the people there
Hmm.
and help position our policies, our workflows, our refunds, whatever it might be, in a way that was favorable and that resonated and that worked for that guest or host.
Okay.
Uh, I think that having someone with quite exactly that skill set is difficult, but ensuring that everyone who comes in is exposed to that idea, that concept,
Mhm.
and that they keep the customer in the forefront, that they're reminded of the emotional weight of these trips, which happen once or twice a year for most families, of the cost, the substantial cost often in these trips,
Mhm.
and to recognize that sometimes maybe the customer is right. And I think that I think sometimes there's an adversarial relationship is expected, and to the extent possible, when I manage my teams and train my teams, would focus on alignment. And it's not novel advice, but I think that there's an adversarial sort of element, like I just need a war with customer service to get what I want. And I think the most successful people were aligned and advocates, and would find themselves, instead of chair to chair facing each other, sort of like sparring, would come over to the other side. So they're sitting beside that customer or that host
Mhm.
and saying, let's work on this together.
Good counsel.
And that it worked, it can work really well in that, if you keep that in the forefront of your mind.
Okay, that's a very powerful, I think, paradigm to share. Let me turn it over to Andre and Eugene. Andre, maybe you can kind of talk about a particularly challenging customer service case that you feel like is really hard to ever solve or to ever overcome.
Yeah, maybe I'm gonna tell you a bit about what happened actually in Bukit Vista lately. So in Bukit Vista, we are facing with a lot of monthly stay for now because we're having a lot of guests that staying for a month because they're stuck in Bali and such. So we're facing with a different type of guests rather than what happened before the Corona. That now we have a kind of long-term booking, if you might call. So we need to have like a different kind of engagement as well with the guests. Like before we just gonna have a chit chat with the guests, and now we have like a different one because we have to make sure that they have a place like a home, like say like that. And we might facing with the bad review. We call it like a bad experience that happened in our guests. In this case, we were doing like this. If we want a bad review, we kind of create a case management system. We report that to the community. We want to make sure that community also supporting this to fix this kind of problems, and we got sometimes also creating a best practices, like it's like a playbook like that. So we won't reinvent the wheel, we won't do this same mistake, or we can just, if we find the same mistake, we can just like use this kind of playbook to all of the team. But my question is like, what actually you do, like when you're facing with a bad review, are you also creating a playbook? If like let's say yes, so how do you roll the playbook to the all the team? How can you actually use that as like, and knowing that if that was the best practices for this kind of case, this kind of things like that? Because I'm curious, because we're here creating like that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Just to make sure I understood, I mean, with the adapting, sort of the changing, evolving relationship you're having with the guests who are now staying much longer, you're encountering some new issues, and the question is, how does something go from whiteboard or a bespoke one-off solution, one-time thing, to a playbook? It it's it's difficult. I would say that it's important to consult with colleagues, and I think that keep the long term in mind is something that we often try to do. At times, we would even quantify it at Airbnb or make attempts to quantify it. You can't perfectly quantify it and see the future, but you could have a pretty reliable and strong indication of like the future value of this guest business and that the likelihood of them to recommend or to repeat book. And so a lot of analysis was done on that front, and I think that if you keep that long term in mind, sometimes like the near term, which may be maybe an unjust sort of complaint, or or just a kind of cultural difference where people just didn't understand or didn't read as closely or didn't had a different expectation, it might make more sense, and it often did at Airbnb, depending, to make the guest whole, ensure that the guest felt supported, so that they might continue to use Airbnb in the future, continue to talk Airbnb, and that word of mouth was an essential component of our growth. Is that when Airbnb comes up around a dinner table or at a bar in any kind of social context, people are like, awesome, loved it, great. And often when there was a bad situation, if we could make it right, if we could get Wishnak on the phone or any of these other people, there would be even higher NPS, because at that point you've done service recovery. It didn't just work perfectly. If it works perfectly, it's kind of uninteresting, and of course it works. But when it doesn't work, if we're able to support them, you have an even bigger promoter. And so I think that to your question, again, it's important in the context there to maybe keep the long term in mind, and potentially, and the best hosts often did this, accommodate that guest, because it often isn't worth the time to sort of nickel and dime and push back, in that context, because long term, hopefully they'll bring more business to you in the long run. And then once that there's some kind of playbook there, or it's happened once or twice, the worst thing that can happen is for everyone's got a career, and not everyone's career is going to be with Bukit Vista, and people with that knowledge to walk out the door. And that tribal knowledge, if it only lives between my ears, then that's not a successful business, because there's going to be natural turnover in the business. And that's a good thing, because everyone's got their own career aspirations. But it is important that it's made available through some kind of digital channel. I mean, digital these days, but some kind of online repository and knowledge base of like, what do we do here? And even if it's just a draft, right? You've got your standard playbook, like lockout or a refund request or something like that. Then there's just kind of a draft thing, which is like, this is an unproven staging ground. We've only had 2 or 3 of these kind of complaints about X, Y, or Z, but here's kind of how we thought about it, and here's what we've done. Even that is helpful, and it gets it, out of just the realm of our mental experience, and puts it on paper so that it can be further iterated. I think that maybe, not to get specific into the detail or into the weeds of the knowledge base, but having just a disclaimer at the top, to say like, this is a work in progress, but hopefully this is a helpful sort of guide toward the paths that have been successful in the past. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. But I have one more actually.
Sure.
I mean, if you have now the playbook, how do you like roll it to all the people there?
Yeah. So I wasn't responsible for that, like in the long run. I mean, I think when I worked on the in the very early days, we would send out like the weekly email, and that's where we would like congratulate people on successful sort of tickets or good satisfaction comments. Also share news updates. Someone was promoted, someone transferred to another team, and share workflow updates. And so I think that like regular pulse of communication was helpful. As we grew, I that was definitely not in my realm. But we had a team that was responsible for sort of the knowledge base, and they would send out alerts and notifications, and they, with some sophisticated system, something like that. But it's for an organization that's many times as large as Bukit Vista, so it doesn't need to be overly complex. It can be a kind of a simple update, like on a biweekly or weekly basis or monthly basis, whatever makes sense for your business, to say, hey, couple of updates here. Check out these 3 articles. We've got evolving workflows on these 2 issues that have just cropped up, or 3 issues.
Conor, to follow up with Andre's question, it's one thing to be notified about this is an update to the workflow. It's quite another thing to actually start exercising and executing the workflow. I don't
Yep.
know about at Airbnb, but I think there's definitely a gap between knowing, there's a gap between notifying that something has changed, reading
Yep.
something has changed, and then being able to actually execute the new workflow. Um, did you ever feel that? And were you able to like find ways to get from, let's say, knowing to actually like production doing?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. It's a weakness. I mean, to be honest, it's something that every organization tries to tackle. And I think part of my job at Airbnb over the years was to ensure that the higher ups a little bit understood the kind of the nitty gritty mechanics of thousands of people
Yeah.
trying to iterate on one workflow, and that while yes, every one of those thousands of people might have received an email or an alert on their computer, people are otherwise like distracted or doing other things. It doesn't mean that that's happening in practice. So
Mm,
I think that it's a really, really good point. As a leader on teams, one thing that I found helpful was that I would try to stay abreast.
okay.
I didn't know all the details, but I would get the same emails they did, and I would try to bring it up as needed and reinforce or repeat the message. Hey,
Mm,
this is a pretty big change to our payout workflow. I
sure.
know that we don't often work on these things, but please take a look. Let me know if you have any questions. If it were something that were a whole scale like readjustment, of course,
Mhm.
like if we have a whole new playbook for cleanliness or something like that, cleanliness being a common complaint, people are like, oh, they have just differing expectations or what have you. Uh, we would, of course, pair that with like either a video training that there's like systems that log that you are watching the video the whole time, or with an in-person training, or with like a kind of a smaller context, like you and your 15 teammates
Mhm.
are all together with your lead
Okay.
watching the video, co-watching the video, so that it's
Mm,
hopefully understood. For sort of the more specialized teams, some of which I ran, would do in-person
okay.
trainings for something like that.
Got it. We actually, I remember Andre Nadine and I came up with a system, and it sort of like was our. I'm coming from an engineering background, so I was like, we could try to think of an engineering system for this, right? So
Yep.
we came up with this way of tackling sort of the unknown. We would say we created a funnel. We said, all right, how many new cases are we discovering every week in terms of, let's say, just converting reservations, right? How many new cases are we actually discovering every week for a particular reservation case that does not turn into a booking? So we start classifying, right? There was some that were spam, some people like on Instagram asking for a free stay. So, okay, we said that these are pretty much not able to be optimized. These are non reservations. And then we looked at a few other cases. Maybe we were a little bit slower getting back to the guest, or maybe the guest asked for something that we didn't really particularly have, or whatever. So we started tracking. Okay, every week are we discovering new cases? And then the second part is, have we written a playbook on the new case that we discovered? And then the third was, if it's being implemented, do we, when we sample and we look
Yep.
around, do we actually see that people are actually, the people that we train, are they actually using the playbook to get it there? And so we could sort of see, of course, conversion loss at each particular stage, right? Like maybe we're discovering 5 cases a week, we're creating a playbook at maybe 2 cases a week, and then training maybe 1 case a month actually goes into the training. So there's always kind of a little bit of a lag time in that one. Um, when you speak of like training, like how do you actually know that the training, even if you all train together, right? How do you know that the training is actually being implemented? Are you looking at like an NPS score, or are you looking at like some other stat to sort of tie it back together? Um, because
Yeah.
training can feel like a black hole, right? You're like training and training. You're wondering, did everyone actually start learning this, or are we still referring to more? I think you said it, the whiteboard patterns or like improvisation patterns.
Right. I'm reminded of a quote. I don't know who it was attributed to, but sometimes people hear things and they smile and nod and do whatever the F, I won't say it, whatever the F they were going to do anyway. And that's it. They're like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. They'll smile, they'll nod. And so I think the question you're asking there as well is that, so not only did they read the notification, that doesn't mean they're doing what you want.
Right.
Not, they also trained. That still doesn't mean they smile, they nod. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing what the workflow says. So
Right.
I think that and I think the term that often is used is adherence,
Mm,
which is kind of a rigid term in my personal view, but I think it's a really important thing. I mean, if you're having thousands and thousands of interactions every day with the community, it's important that they're not playing sort of like roulette a little bit. Like, depends on who they get on the phone, maybe they'll get a different outcome.
Right.
That's not good. Think of a restaurant.
Right.
You don't want inconsistent quality food and just differing outcomes. Like, when you order the chicken or whatever it is that you order, it should be the same every time, more or less, unless you request something different, and undercooked, overcooked, whatever it is. You would never, of course, order undercooked chicken or any other food. But in any case, you get the idea.
I do.
So I think that audits, so the adherence is measured through audits. And I think that just as a team leader, it's important. I mean, even as I, moved into sort of even more senior roles away from just like a direct team leader to like managing team leaders, I found it really invaluable. My currency as a leader, and just also my currency is like my intelligence about sort of the community. If I wasn't jumping in or weren't jumping in on tickets, I would feel like I'm losing my touch, losing my edge. So I absolutely would jump in. Now and again, I'd even take an escalation of a certain caliber, but more often than not, I was involved in watching and aware. And I think people, hopefully on the team, understand and like that, because the last thing you want is a boss who is completely disconnected and sort of floating around trying to get their next promotion and just doesn't know or care about what you're doing. Yep. And I hope I wasn't that boss. And I think that I try to stay really close to what's going on in the community, because it's good for the team. I have a better sense of what's happening in terms of the quality of the follow through on trainings and new workflows. And it's good for me as I, understand the business even better, because the community knows it best.
Perfect. That's really good. I think it's super vital as we become leaders to definitely be in touch with the context of what's going on, so that in many ways I feel like customer support is the closest thing to like battle, I don't know, in the business. You're always like you said, there's a little bit of that adversarial, like people go into customer support necessarily to like, I want my refund, right? I've been cheated. I need to get even. And there's always like a, there's a bit of tension in how to diffuse that. Okay, let's go next to Nadine. Nadine, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Conor?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Actually, I like the idea that you mentioned about the if we can provide something that, or maybe a solution that the guests they want, the way they want, and help them to understand. Actually, I like that idea, but it's actually difficult to apply maybe from my side, because I often encounter so many complaints, and I'm not sure actually if they stop complaining, if they understand, or they just tired and go with their dissatisfaction or something. So how do you actually do that? Help them to understand, and how do you ensure that they understand and they feel it? They feel like, yeah, it's fair, and yeah. How do you make sure that actually?
That's a great question, Nadine. I think that it helps that for much of my time, I was a leader at Airbnb and, a manager. And so I was often an escalation point. And I think that there's kind of a finality or a confidence that it can be registered in the way you present a solution. One, never rush to it. I mean, that was just like a base is often like, if I know that someone's not going to get a refund or whatever they're desiring is not among the options I can give them, I don't come out and immediately say it immediately. I think it's important that I don't want to like give them a runaround, but I want to first make sure that I'm absorbing, because often people just want to be heard and to know that they're heard by maybe the right people, or that if you're not the right person to hear it, that you will, as an advocate of theirs, share that feedback. I understand that this policy, you feel is not consumer friendly, and that you feel like you were misled in some way. I want you to know that I sit here in our San Francisco headquarters. I work often. We have sort of like weekly or monthly syncs with our product team, and we share these stories, because we would be nowhere without the growth of our community and the happiness of our community. So while I'm not able to do that, and I just sort of kind of dropped into sort of some of the stuff that I would have said on a real call, but to make sure, like with some specifics, that like it's not fake. And I think what their thought is that it is fake. And by what I mean when I say it's fake, it's that you've reached someone 5,000 miles away from anyone who makes any shot calls, like who makes any of the policies, who has any stake in the game, someone who is here just to do a paycheck and just to get home, and who actually just doesn't care. And I think adding some specificity, clarifying and aligning with them that like, I care, you've raised an issue and I understand that you're disappointed, in that. And then also clarifying, hopefully, that there is such an outlet. Don't lie, of course, but that there is such an outlet that the company does take it seriously, that its policies do evolve, and it is evolving based on the feedback of people like you. And that my job is not only to assist you in those cases, but also to help channel your voice to the people who make those decisions at our headquarters or in our company. And that might not be what you want, but it is the truth. And so what's happening there is not only the content, right? The content of what I'm saying, but it's also the finality and the honesty in it. And I think that people, it's one of my, fortunes when taking these calls that I'm not the first line. So I recognize that it's harder on the first line. They're like, oh, who are you? You just don't get it. Let me speak to your boss. So I recognize that, and that might not be perfect, but if you can inform and channel a little bit of that confidence, a little bit of that comfort, and a little of that humanity, that this is how it works, hopefully it can be helpful in helping them understand. Because the last thing you want people to do, and you can't quite say it like this, but is to beat their head against a wall, and that hurts, right? And if you see someone who's starting to do that, you don't want anyone to do that. Even if you're the wall, right? You like out of self-preservation, you don't want them to beat you, but you're also like, look, I know, you can invest another couple days of your life and your time trying to call and appeal but that's you're not going to get further. I think you've reached the limits of our organization, and I have personally spoken with my manager, and we've talked about whatever the details are. Getting them along and moving forward with their life, with their vacation, whatever it might be, can be helpful. But it's really difficult, and there are no easy answers with these kind of complaints or concerns that come up, especially cross-cultural, cross-border. It's a difficult business.
Okay, thank you, Nadine. Did that answer your question? Or okay?
Yes, thank you, Conor. That's very insightful, actually.
I'm going to pick out a particular point that Conor mentioned, which was the finality of it. Like, I think a lot of times when people are necessarily like new or they're just beginning customer support, there's this kind of hope that there's always like a better solution, right?
Right.
Maybe I can pull something out of the sky, and if I just have more time, and of course sometimes guests can really push you against the corner where they're asking, you ruined my life. This was supposed to be this awesome moment, and now I'm left like here. You owe me your unborn child, right? And you're like, yes, I do, right? But I think there's maybe it's an emotional maturity or something where you have to just say, okay, no, enough is enough. I've heard you, but I can't give you any more. I've heard you, but I can't give you any more. This is essentially it. And I guess it's also because within a company, and in your particular position, you're a leader, that's something more. Is it a hard border, or can it always be moved back a little bit? And how do you decide what is that final like straw? Because in certain cases it might be worthwhile. Like Beyonce, let's say she has a terrible Airbnb experience. Maybe it's not worth it for her to tweet about that, right? So maybe we can look after her. But like in a certain context, like how do you decide on the line? Is it something that you can make into an SOP? It's like, okay, you take kind of like the number of followers and divide it by like the length of stay, or is it really like a case by case situation where you decide where's the line of no more favors?
Yeah, I think it's kind of case by case. I mean, we try to treat customers evenly and apply policies as neutrally as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if there's some kind of context with Beyonce's reservation, perhaps like I would want a second opinion. I would imagine others would as well. And of course, things do get bumped up. Obviously, Airbnb's been sued before. I'm taken to court. Airbnb people tweet about Airbnb. So obviously, there are other channels, and people can escalate it.
Mhm.
And that's, of course, their right. Like, by all means, we don't want it to get there. That suggests a failure in some way of our product, or of our service, or the way that we support them. We weren't able to help them understand, or they're pointing out further gaps. And I think that's data points, to be honest. And I think, the best companies use that as data points, and are aware, like, you're poking some soft spots in our policies. Like, we are getting this, where along this process did we fail? Was it upstream at the product? Was it in the policy? Was it in the application of the policy, or in the support misrepresent something? But we need to tighten that up, hopefully, in the future. In terms of like a hard and fast rule, like, there were certainly times that I would, distill the issue and share it with others within Airbnb. Like, absolutely. There are going to be those times. And how did I know? I'm often reminded, in the Supreme Court in the United States has like sort of a rule of thumb. I think it's, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's for pornography. Forgive me. It might be for profanity. In any case, it's the litmus test is you'll know it when you see it. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about either of those two things, of course, but I'm saying they were trying to define what is profanity, what is pornography, and it was like, you'll know it when you'll see it. Yeah. That's the litmus test, essentially. And I think that's hard. I mean, that's kind of hard. That's inherently subjective, but I think was helpful for people to know is that you'll know when there's a unique call, if it's Beyonce on the line or whatever. I want to kick this to another level and have a further conversation about that. And so I think that was something that, we actually had trainings on that. And my team was like, you'll know it when you see it. We would try to sort of role play and talk through, like, would this constitute something when you see it? What are the variables? What specifically is it? And I think specificity is something that, came back to us. If people, were like, I'm just mad. But if people were like talking about taking very specific actions at a specific time, and and there was just like a coherence, they were well spoken, they were focused, and you're just like, okay, it sounds like they're not bluffing. Like, there might be something that we should investigate further, and maybe it makes sense to support them in a unique way.
Okay. Got it. Okay, that's interesting to take. I think I see Tendi there. Tendi, thank you for joining us. Tendi, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Conor on your side?
Okay, nice to meet you, Conor. My name is Tendi. My pleasure to can meet you here, and then thank you, Sujing, to make this session. Yeah, I think my question is more about the leadership things, because I saw you lead some teams as well, and then you are a program manager and community support. So maybe because I also leading a small team, community manager in Bukit Vista, and maybe the first things before I talking deeply, maybe I want to know, like, what is the most challenge for you to lead the team? I know it's not easier to lead the team, right? But I want to know what is the most challenge for you to lead your team. I think you are.
Forgive me, that's that mute button strikes again. That's a great question. So for the last couple of years, I was an independent contributor. I worked on cross-functional teams, but I didn't have direct reports. And in some ways I missed it. In some ways I definitely didn't. And, after a number of years, it was nice to not have that. I think that it can be, when I look back on it, some of the most rewarding times we're working with and developing people, getting to know them as people. And I talked earlier a little bit about attrition, or like people moving on. And those are some of my fondest and proudest memories of people who came to our team, recognize that this isn't the end point of your career, it's a waypoint. It is just a brief stop on your career, and you will spend another dozens of years working, and hopefully along the way here, you'll refer back to your time at Bukit Vista, at Airbnb, on my team. And, so the most challenging part I think, it's just people have different personalities and communication styles. And so you have to adapt. And, I found that isn't always easy, is to understand that sometimes people, it's really important for them to vent. Some people really want to share a lot about their life, their personal life. And that's the way that they help share context and connect with people. And it wouldn't bleed into their work in any way, but it's just something you're like, okay, and you can make you have a better understanding of some person, because I think that some people are just business, just like, I want to only talk about my metrics and my case, and that's it. And I think I don't want to pry. I also don't want to, it's just, you have to adapt based on each member of the team. And of course, also feedback. Your communication style has to adapt a little bit. And some people, are a little more sensitive to feedback, and it's important that you sandwich it in a way and frame it in a way. I'm a huge believer in feedback, and I think that it's truly, done right. It's a form of generosity. And, I think of, I was maybe 7 years, 6, 7, I don't know, 5, 6 years into Airbnb. And before I had a piece of feedback that really just stopped me in my tracks. I had a new boss at the time, a couple months on the job. And in my performance review, which otherwise went well, he said, I have a bit of feedback for you. You say a lot. Sorry. What? I say a lot? Yeah, I noticed it. You have like a lot of great points. You're well regarded within the team when you speak up, but you say a lot. No one had ever told me this. And of course, as I went back and I started thinking about it, and it became a thing that I'm enormously and forever grateful to this individual by the name of Darren for telling me this, because no one else really mentioned it to me. And I think he believed that it was maybe a gap in my understanding. And I think that feedback, he shared it in a way that was not judgmental, but was just like, hey, you might not notice this, but it can affect the way people view you, or the salience or the effectiveness of your message if you say a lot.
That's correct.
So try to count it and try to work on it. So every time I would present to the team afterward, I would G-chat or Slack my boss at the time and say, I counted 4 ums. And he'd say, I think there were 6, or whatever it might be. But it was moving down. Because before it was just every other sentence had an and it was just a filler. It was like I wasn't thinking, it was a filler. So back to your question, finding the right way to do that feedback, to do it with a spirit of generosity, and to, as needed, to sort of couch it with some positive framing and intent, to make sure that it doesn't injure or wound that individual, because it ultimately is generosity, and you want them to be the best version of themselves at work and just as people.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Tandy, any other questions at the moment?
Yes, I think I get the point. Yeah, I think that's a great challenge, and then also that's an opportunity as well, actually, to get more feedback to grow your team, right? And then I think after you get feedback, because I think this is the quote from Robert as well, the leader create more leader, right? So how do you using that what's called quote of the leadership to create the leader, because it's hard for the leader to create a leader in the team, because what I know, it's if there is a lot of leader, you will be facing a lot of argument and everything, right? And then because of now in this situation, maybe it's if someone know you are a leader, maybe they want just a follower. Mostly they want the follower, just what should I do next, what is your suggestion, rather than they thinking by self and then trying to find their own way and then back to discuss it like that. So yeah, that's actually the most challenge for me as well, how actually you make that strategy.
Yeah, I remember a case, or not a case, I can't remember the specifics of the case, but I remember being sort of a junior, member on the team many, many years ago, and asking my boss about a total headache of a case that was really complex with all these variables and whatnot. And she said, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Well, I just email. I want you just tell me what to do." And I found myself in a leadership position a couple of years later where I was like, wait, that made all the sense in the world. And
Yeah.
and I tell people that too, because immediately their first reaction will be like mine when I first got it. I was like, you do your job, Jing. Like, you tell me, you're the boss. Like, and it's like, I am here and I will guide you through this, but I really want you to use your faculties to approach it. Well, so I know our policy says this, but I was looking at the profile and I think that the economics, whatever it might be, like, apply some of your judgment there. I trust you. And I think that's what it's about. Ultimately, it's about trust. And so to your point there, Tendi, I think that parlaying it back and saying, what do you think? You've got the capabilities. I believe in you, and that you will grow as you try to puzzle through some of these problems. I don't want to be the easy button. And in the United States, there was an advertising campaign. You can Google it, for an office sort of a supply company called Staples. And Staples had a little red button. They had a marketing campaign around a little red button, and it was just a joke, and you could press it, and it was the easy button, and it just made everything easy. And that was their marketing campaign. You as a boss don't want to be an easy button. And that would be sort of like a personal advice to you, is that if people are just like, hey, easy button, Tendi, tell me what to do. Tendi, they're not growing. They're just sort of using you as like a tool. And I think that you can hopefully successfully frame it back to them and say, listen, I'm happy to help. I get why you're coming to me. And I do have some more experience and knowledge in this space, but I want to help guide you, because you will one day be in my shoes. And they're like, no kidding, I'll be in your shoes? And like, yes, you have a long career ahead of you and I believe in you. So I want you to use some of your faculties and your ideas to sort of puzzle through this problem yourself.
Beautiful. Okay. Right. That was inspirational, actually.
Amazing. Yeah, that's inspiration. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
Conor. Yeah.
Too kind.
Conor, that's pretty much it. That's the time that we have. And I want to say thank you to Mr. Conor Welch for coming today to be part of our Startup Masterclass and teaching a lot about customer service, about good counsel and leadership and understanding the customer and just so many good things. I'm going to be rewatching this for sure, because I think there's really some good nuggets that I mean, you kind of know that they're there, but then it's like it's not until you hear somebody tell you, okay, this is specifically how you execute it, that actually dissolves away the uncertainty and makes it it crystallizes it. So some good definite nuggets there. So I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Conor, for your time today, and we would like to invite you to future events. Actually, I think this is great. We do regular. I'm using now. We do regular events. I just become conscious of it. We do regular events at Indonesian or Southwest. Oh God, I'm doing it again now. We do regular events in universities across Southeast Asia. So during those events, we invite speakers to come and just share their knowledge with us and a wider student body. So I'm hoping that can be an option in the future too as well. But I just want to say a great thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And let's keep in touch.
We'll do that.
Thank you, Conor, Mr. Conor.